Thank you all. Thank you to our hosts in this magnificent institution. Oscar Wilde, as everybody knows, once defined the cynic as someone who knows everything about prices and nothing about values. He might have added that cynics also have no idea, can't even fathom the possibility that two politicians from across waters can get together out of comradeship and out of collegiality in order to work together for common causes. And they seek advisors and paid advisors for that matter everywhere. So is finance fit for the purpose? Well, the good thing about having giants on whose shoulders to stand is that you don't have to make it up from scratch. Here's something that a person familiar to you wrote precisely 80 years ago. Speculators may do no harm as bubbles on a steady stream of enterprise. But the position is serious when enterprise becomes a bubble on a whirlpool of speculation. When the capital development of a country becomes a byproduct of the activities of a casino, the job is likely to be ill done. John Maynard Keynes in the General Theory 1936. After the war, and after the Bretton Woods Conference, in which John Maynard Keynes was a famous participant, even though he lost the argument to the Americans, not because his argument was weaker, but because Britain was weaker. The Bretton Woods era was not the golden century or the golden period of capitalism for no reason. Let me remind you, and inform those who didn't know it, but President Roosevelt insisted that in the Bretton Woods Conference, which designed the financial system that gave capitalism its best period, bankers were banned. Not one banker was allowed to be there. That was not by accident. It was the result of the 1929 experience. So for 20 years, 25 years or so, during the period of low inflation, high growth, shrinking inequality, banking was boring. The financial sector was well bottled in. The genie was not let loose. Things changed after the collapse of Bretton Woods. At the technical level, and I hope Anastasia here permits me to tread into her territory, there was a very interesting mutation, a conversion that happened. Insurance is, of course, a way of reducing risk. So you buy a car, you get an insurance contract. You buy shares, you may get an option to sell at the same price as you bought. You pay for this. It gives you the right, if you buy shares, sell a bunch of shares for £1 million, and you also buy the right, the option, to sell them at £1 million a year later. So if that costs you £100,000, you've lost £100,000 if the shares go up. If the share goes down, the most you can lose is £100,000. But then suddenly, this mutation took place. Instead of just being able to buy an option to sell at a given price, you can buy a contract to purchase other shares that you haven't purchased. Technically speaking, these are mirror images of one another. They don't seem very different. So if you imagine that you were to purchase a batch of shares for £1 million and also pay another £100,000 to purchase the obligation to buy another such bunch of shares a year from now at the original price. Now, if, let's say, you envisage for some reason that these shares would go up by 40%, if you hadn't purchased that contract to buy, you would simply make £400,000. But if you buy for £100,000 that contract, then because the shares will be worth a lot more, and you will buy another million on top of the existing million at the current price, your profit will be 800,000 minus the 100,000 that you paid for it. So you make 700,000. And then suddenly the idea entered the mind of the whiz kids in the various financial centers. Well, why buy shares then? Let's just buy options. Let's just buy the right to buy shares. Because if you spend 1.1 million on these options, these contracts to buy, and not on the shares, not on the underlying shares, and the market goes up by 40%, then you have a profit of 4.4 million. So on the upturn, the profits are turbocharged, And of course, on the downturn, you're completely and utterly ruined. Not unless, of course, you're a banker, because then you get bailed out. So if you're a banker and you know that you'll be bailed out, or you suspect you will be, then during the upturn, the more money you borrow, the more you turbocharge your debt, your profits. If you can get a hold of everybody's money, you will, and you do it, you utilize it in order to purchase these contracts. So this is leverage, and the hyper profits that result from that, and the 2008 experience during the downturn. So you have this financial innovation. There's no innovation here. It's a new form of debt, and turbocharged debt at that. But what makes it particularly powerful is the fact that it is state-financed, in a sense. The repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, the repeal of the separation of bread and butter, plain vanilla as the Americans call them, banks, which simply take in deposits and create money through the money market multiplier, and the casino that John Maynard Keynes was referring to. The end of that separation allowed Barclays, Société Générale, Deutsche Bank, the National Bank of Greece, to indulge in using their own capacity as a bank to borrow and borrow and borrow, to turbocharge their profits through turbocharging their debt, being subsidized by the state, and having their back by central banks and the state. The subsidized debt turbocharging takes many different forms, like for instance, allowing banks to keep only 3% of the earnings as accumulated equity. No company in the world would ever imagine functioning by having only 3% of its balance sheet as equity. And very slowly but steadily, bankers, from being on the sidelines of capitalism, became the occupiers of driving seats. Now the question is, why? Why was this change suddenly? Not only technically, but in terms of the politics of this transformation. I will present my thesis. I've written a whole book about it some years ago. I'll present it very briefly by saying this. The Bretton Woods system was based on a fixed exchange rate regime with capital controls, the financial genie in the bottle, and what the gold standard lacked in the 1920s, a mechanism for recycling surpluses from where they were being produced to the deficit regions in order to revive the capacity of the deficit regions to keep purchasing goods from the surplus regions in order to replenish the surpluses. And what was this surplus recycling mechanism? It was called the United States government. The Marshall Plan, for instance, but not only the Marshall Plan. The United States was run by New Dealers in the 1940s, and even under Eisenhower and Republican administration later, they understood that unless you play a hegemonic role in the global system that you are effectively running, administering, then your own surpluses will be in jeopardy. Something that Germany has never understood, to everyone's detriment. Unfortunately, that system collapsed. Why did it collapse? Because you can only recycle surpluses if you have them. The United States lost surpluses by the late 1960s, and the whole system collapsed. And how did it manage to retain its hegemony? I shall quote from Paul Volcker, who later, much later, became the chairman of the Fed, when he was working with Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon and John Connolly. Henry Kissinger put a question to him. He said, how do you think we can retain our hegemony, given that we are now a deficit country? And he very cutely answered, well, if we can't recycle our surpluses, we must recycle other people's surpluses. And that they did for 25, 30 years through the twin deficits of the United States. The United States operated like a huge vacuum cleaner, sucking into its territory the net exports of Germany, Japan, later China, and the profits made by Japanese, Chinese, German capitalists. So it was recycling other people's surpluses and operating as the provider of aggregate demand for the centers of capitalism. But on the back of the tsunami of capital that was going from the rest of the world into New York, financialization happened. Because what do bankers do if you give them 5 billion net a day to play with, even for 10 minutes? They find ways through these innovations of breeding it, of making it much bigger. I gave you just a very cursory example of how that happened. And that pyramid of paper money collapsed in 2008, and the world economy has lost its poise, it has lost its capacity to recycle surpluses and deficits, and this is why we have a crisis that is metamorphosizing everywhere, in China, in Britain, in Germany. In Germany, do you know Germany has the lowest level of investment since 1945, at a time when there are negative interest rates? This is mind-boggling. You only have to state it to realize what kind of a mess we're in. Okay, Greece, it's a basket case. It's a bankrupt state. I can tell you all about it, but not today. Yeah? But for Germany to have negative interest rates and the lowest level of investment ever, this is a sign that we live in troubled times. And the troubled times have to do with the inability of globalized, financialized capitalism after Bretton Woods to recover. So what should we do? Okay, let's say I'm right. I'm not saying that I'm right. Assume we're right. We're economists, we can assume anything. We always do. We begin our lectures. Now, in medicine, we regulate drugs, testing, and all that. When we build a bridge or a building, we regulate it. In finance, we claim we regulate finance. We don't do it. The bankers regulate finance, and they write the laws, and we pretend to be the ones that are imposing upon them. The United Kingdom's Independent Commission on Banking, for instance, recommended under John Vickers, if I remember correctly, that the Basel limit of 3% of equity goes up to 4%. The bankers screamed, they threatened, they moaned, they begged. Reminding me of Thatcher's infamous expression, they were moaning minis. Yeah? And they got it. They managed to kill it. Now, the increase of equity from 3% to 4% sounds minuscule. Why did they kick and scream so much? My recommendation, and this is how I'm going to close my talk, one of my recommendations would be that you should go up to 20 or 25% and let them kick and scream. There's no reason why it shouldn't. All their reasons are bogus. But why did they fight so hard to prevent the rise of the minimum equity from 3 to 4%? Let me tell you why. Because it translated to a 25% reduction in their bonuses. Very straightforward, yeah? It's a back-of-envelope calculation, but it's sound. Let me put it this way. If it goes from 3 to 4% the equity ratio, you've got a 1/3, 1/4 rise. Okay? And that means that the turbocharging of the returns to equity, which then are pocketed as bonuses, goes down by around a quarter, 25%. So let me just address this, to get this out of the way. With a 20-25% equity, minimum equity ratio, the financial institutions should be able to absorb the kind of downturns which are on the cards without requiring socialism for the bankers and unfettered, untrammeled, brutal capitals for everyone else. Yeah? Now, the arguments of the financial sector, and I realize that I'm in the City of London, which fills me with a bit of trepidation saying this, is that firstly, equity is too expensive. Yes, it is expensive. But you know why it's so expensive? It's because it's so economics 101. It's very scarce. They have no equity. So when there is something in short supply, its value is high. If we had much higher equity, then the marginal value of £1 extra equity would be much, much lower. Economics students, first semester students understand that. Bankers pretend not to understand it, but you know, when they talk to their clients, oh, they fully understand it. They get it. The second argument against raising so substantially the minimum equity ratio is that this would reduce the credit to the real economy, pull the other one. If a bank is profitable, all it has to do to meet the high equity requirement is to simply accumulate earnings until it reaches the 20–25%. And if it's not profitable, why should it be expanding its balance sheets? An unprofitable bank that expands its assets, its balance sheet, is dynamite. And it should be wound down very slowly, but very decisively. Another argument, which this is my favorite one, that banks will be forced to hold more capital. Do they think they speak to morons? Capital is not an asset for a bank. Yeah? It is not a substitute for lending. Capital, like debt, is a liability for a bank. So what we are effectively saying is that instead of funding lending through debt, they should be funding lending through capital. Now, they don't want to do that because they can't turbocharge the way I described before, this kind of lending. So allow me to begin winding down with two concrete proposals. One is a 3-point plan for potential financial sector regulation within the nation state, domestic. And the second one will be another 3-point plan for the macro-financial environment within which the financial sector of the domestic economy must live and breathe. So, beginning with the domestic regulation. I've already explained the minimum equity requirement of 20% over the balance sheet of the banks. Secondly, Anastasia, I do seriously believe that it is highly feasible to have a modern version of the Glass-Steagall Act. It is really very simple. The 4 B's. Bring back boring banks. Banks that do not have the capacity, that it is simply illegal to lever up existing debt in order to gamble. There is the fact that this may spill over into the shadow bank sector was never an argument for instance, selling heroin in news agencies. The fact that you may have illicit trade. The capacity of a huge bank like the Royal Bank of Scotland to do damage is infinitely worse than that of the shadow bank sector. And finally, the third part, first point of the plan for the domestic economy is to end all naked futures trades. It is really very simple. If you want to have car insurance, you must own a car. If you want to get an option to sell something, you must first own it. Really very simple. I mean, you can state it in half a paragraph. Speaking now, turning to the 3-point plan for the macro-financial environment. Well, how about repealing all legislation and all tax codes that are subsidizing private turbocharged debt? To end all the tax exemptions that subsidize debt financing at the expense and penalize equity financing. This can also take the form of interventions in a variety of areas. For instance, take for the British scheme of subsidizing those who purchase apartments and houses in order to rent them. Now, what is this? Are we trying to create further volatility in the financialized housing market? What is the point of that? You might as well take the money and give it to any good cause except for that. Secondly, this is something that Richard Murphy, others have discussed. I've been working on this now since 2003. I call it investment priming quantitative easing. It is something that a Labour government should coordinate with hopefully democratized European Union, Eurozone, in conjunction with the European Investment Bank and the new investment bank that Britain needs. Think about it. As we speak, there is at least 2.5 trillion pounds of idle cash in the European financial sector, doing nothing except bidding up share prices, house prices, doing nasty things, not good things, not invested in productive activities, green technologies, green energy, and so on and so forth. if the European Investment Bank and the new investment bank here in Britain issues their own bonds in order to create a stream, a constant stream of patient investment funding for all the good things that we need to produce more of, not the things that we need fewer of, and the ECB with the Bank of England are standing idly by in the secondary markets, ready to purchase those bonds if their yields start going up, then suddenly you're going to have QE that is not toxic, which is not creating deflation in Germany, and it is not failing to deter recession in places like Greece, or indeed in the north of England. At the supranational level, I believe a Labour government should outline a policy or a blueprint for a new Bretton Woods. And this is something that maybe we should have a whole new discussion about, but I have this view that Keynes's idea of an international clearing union now is feasible. It was far less feasible in 1944 when he suggested the Bretton Woods. Now we have the capacity, we have the digital accounting systems, digital currencies, digital distributed ledgers that would allow us to create a unit of account that effectively regulates trade and capital flows in such a way as to create, in a sense, the equivalent of a congestion charge for sudden capital flows that are destabilizing both the emerging markets and the developed world. But this is a very large discussion, which I'm sure we'll have at some other time. Let me finish by reminding some of the leftists in our midst that Marx defined money as the alienated ability of humanity. It's time to put the genie back into the bottle so that humanity's abilities can re-emerge as humanity flourishes once more the way it can. Thank you very much.